Let's get started. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Vashon Heritage Museum Talks. Tonight's presentation is Water Protectors, Museums and Movements. We send out a big thank you and acknowledgement to For Culture for sponsoring our museum talk series. I'm Elsa Kroonquist, Executive Director of the Heritage Museum, and I'd like to introduce Chris Austin. He is a museum board member. And as is our tradition, Chris, will you please open with our talk of recognizing the Native people.
Thank you, Elsa. We acknowledge and recognize that we are on the ancestral lands and traditional home of the Shwabopts, Coast Salish Native people, the first people of Vashon Island. This land was their home long before Euro-American voyagers and settlers came, and they were forcibly removed from these islands and relocated onto neighboring reservations, including Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot. Vashon Island is their traditional home, and their historical relationship with the land continues today. We honor the island itself and the Shwabopts people, past and present.
Thank you, Chris. And with that same intent, we state Black Lives Matter. Vashon Maury Island Heritage Museum rejects racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience. Stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of cultures and histories. And now, Chris, will you introduce tonight's speakers?
Yes, I will. Tonight's presenter are Beka Economopoulos. She is a co-founder of the Natural History Museum, is a member of the Association of Science Museum Directors, was a co-organizer and board member of the 2017 March for Science, a 2018 Roddenberry Fellow, and was honored as one of Grist Magazine's top 50 environmental leaders of 2020. And joining Beka is Jason Jones, also a co-founder of the Natural History Museum, an award-winning filmmaker, artist, cultural strategist, and curator. He received his BFA at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and is a graduate of the Whitney Independent Study Program. The Natural History Museum itself is a traveling pop-up museum that works with communities, artists, scientists, and scholars to create new narratives about our shared history and future. Please welcome Beka and Jason with Water Protectors, Museums, and Movements.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Elsa, and everybody at the Vashon Heritage Museum for hosting us tonight. And I want to start by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of these lands and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. Jason and I are with Not an Alternative, a nonprofit collective formed in 2004 of artists, activists, scholars, cultural strategists. And in 2014, we launched the Natural History Museum, which has been our full-time ongoing project since then. And we started the museum, if I'm to speak bombastically, as a sort of Trojan horse strategy to get inside the museum sector with an aim to change it from within. And also to sort of leverage the authoritative vocabulary and aesthetics of these institutions that communicate science to the public and mediate our understandings of nature and culture and our role in the world. We found that museums are incredibly influential as a sector. They're a top 3 family destination, a $51 billion industry, so bigger than Hollywood. More visitors annually than sporting events and theme parks combined. And poll after poll shows that museums are among the most trusted sources of information in society. So at a time of great mistrust in our bedrock institutions and in science and facts and so on, that's a lot of influence and cultural capital. And also in this time of a national reckoning with American history and with structural racism. Our monuments are coming down. Our institutions are being called on to redress colonial and environmental harms. And our society is grappling with the question of what takes their place. What values and histories do we choose to carry forward in this time of overlapping social, economic, and environmental crisis? So we, figured rather than shaking a fist from the outside, we'll join the museum sector. We have skills and as artists and exhibit designers and organizers. So we entered into our fake it till you make it phase. Invested our very first grant into the material infrastructure that would make us believable as a museum. So this is our studio back in Brooklyn, New York, where we were based for 20 years. And our mood board, thinking about the aesthetic and historical references that inform our perspective as a museum. We worked with a costume designer in the early days and thinking about those sort of references of the work progress administration and the prototypical and early natural history museums. Our kid was a toddler at the time, 3 years old, and when we were first launching this, and we got taxidermy off of eBay, and I remember that was very interesting to her. We were getting packages in the mail that she could open up, and we also invested in pipe fittings and canvas and this sort of modular tent structure that could reference expeditions, but also disaster response and in a time of the climate emergency, migration, and other concerns that we wanted to talk about. And that infrastructure allowed us to set up a museum inside other museums or out in the field or on tribal lands or at contested environmental sites. And we designed a bus wrap. We bought a former airport shuttle bus that just barely ran and wrapped it to look like a natural history museum bus that could then travel our exhibits, but we could also do things like toxic tours to contested sites led by scientists or community activists and so on. We still had the bench seating so everybody could face each other inside and have great discussions. And there's a bus on the road. And then, to lend credibility to our efforts to be taken seriously as a traveling and pop-up museum, we formed an advisory board with luminaries from various backgrounds, Nobel laureates and Naomi Klein, and indigenous leaders and scientists and artists. Became card-carrying members of the American Alliance Museums, and launched our first exhibition at the Queen's Museum in New York. And that's where it was time to coincide with the People's Climate March, which was at the time the largest mobilization around climate change in human history in 2014. And so in tandem with that, we had our first exhibition as a museum within a museum, where we took the opportunity to organize panel discussions and talks with scientists, there's Michael Mann, with media theorists, with climate justice activists and community members. And produced this video series that features, global figures on this question of what is the museum of the future from various backgrounds. and reached out to the American Alliance of Museums and asked them, how about we come to your next museum convention? We could park our bus outside and we could screen this video series. And they said, that's not going to work. We're like bummed. Because there's not really space outside of the convention. There's a taxi stand. So instead, we're going to invite you to exhibit on the convention floor. We told them there's no way we can afford that. So we ended up with a $15,000 spot for about $600, because the Center for the Future of Museums and the American Alliance of Museums said, you're raising the questions that we're encouraging museums to grapple with vis-a-vis the future, vis-a-vis ethical funding, climate change, environmental justice, social justice, and other concerns. So we embedded within the sector. I learned one day that in my online research that the Association of Science Museum Directors was a thing. And all you had to do was fill out a form and send in a $50 check, and you're a member and can go to the annual retreats with 50 other science and natural history museum directors from North America. So this is my very first science museum director retreat. I was so nervous. I should take a step back and say one of the reasons why I was nervous is the impetus for this project initially was as an art and activism collective with organizing experience and producing interventions and direct actions and videos and so on. We'd been hired for fee-for-service work by labor unions and NGOs and others. And there was an organization, a climate organization that had reached out, and since we were based in New York, and David Koch was New York's wealthiest person, but also a top funder of climate science disinformation campaigns to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. And Hurricane Sandy had just happened, a major climate disaster in New York City that had great ripple effects and social justice impacts. They were interested in us working with them on a campaign called Make Koch Pay, get them to pay for Hurricane Sandy cleanup and disaster relief. As we dug into it, that particular project didn't feel like it made sense for us, but we learned that Koch sat on the board of New York's American Museum of Natural History, one of our country's oldest and most influential science communication institutions, with a board member and major donor in a leadership position who's funding science disinformation. So the contradiction there was too great. And when we launched the Natural History Museum, we teamed up with about 100 of the world's 150 of the world's top scientists and Nobel laureates to release a letter calling on museums to cut all ties to fossil fuel interests. And when we did this, I'll say it was the most viral thing that I've ever done in 20 years of activism, with headlines around the world in all kinds of beats, right? Arts, culture, science, the environment, philanthropy, higher education, really kicked off some sector-wide soul searching, and was the topic of museum convention panels and annual report that the Center for the Future of Museums put out. So that's the backdrop for me entering into showing up what felt very subversive and slightly random to my first Science Museum Director retreat. So I posted on Facebook the week before, does anybody have clothes or jewelry that will make me look wealthy and professional? And my friend who is an art museum director said, sure, come raid my closet. And so I borrowed some of her chunky jewelry. And I captioned this photo, Science Museum directors in their natural habitat. We're now 5-6 years into going to these retreats, and it's been an incredible opportunity to get a better understanding of and build relationships. So I'll get a little more into that. Went from our fake it till you make it phase, embedding within the sector, to our fossil-free culture phase, or I like to call it our shit disturbing phase. So this is the coverage of that letter, Science and Cultural Figures, calling on all museums to cut ties to fossil fuel interests. And part of the thinking behind this was, who are museums going to pay attention to? In particular, if we're aiming to get a $13 million donor off the board, we can't bike walk ourselves to the entrance of the American Museum of Natural History, right? Because the people visiting there, the homeschooling groups, the field trips, the families, likely are very sympathetic, and that isn't a tactic that's going to win hearts and minds on that one. And in particular, we were thinking about, how do we split the institutions, reveal these sort of fault lines? And it's scientists as a constituency that were not effectively mobilized, that have not raised their voices at this point very prominently on these concerns, and that rather than the usual suspects of climate activists calling on the museum, we mobilize scientists around the world and Nobel laureates, and the headlines reflected that. So I think it was taken much more seriously. So really thinking about that choreography, that sort of strategic interplay of inside and outside strategies to accelerate transformational change. And that has been our guiding star. This project, as artists and activists and organizers, has been a series of experiments and test balloons and recalibrations and course corrections and so on along the way. But our guiding star, I think, is asking this question in a time of great polarization and mistrust in institutions and in facts and so on. Can these institutions that have been sitting on the sidelines, or maybe not effectively deployed, or really not effectively played across the board a role as allies to movements, that's the guiding star question, is, can these institutions become a part of our social movement infrastructure, champion science for the common good? And so we sought to answer that question, wrote an op-ed in The Guardian that challenged the pushback that we were getting from some museums that were saying, this is great, but we're neutral. We're scientists, we're neutral. We're museums, we're neutral. So we can't do what you're asking us to do. So tackling that myth of neutrality and writing op-eds and publishing and so on. And this post in The Guardian, the largest English-speaking media outlet in the world now, was shared more than 11,000 times in 1 week. And if you remember, Chris Rock, musician, had an op-ed in The Guardian that same week, but we beat him by 4,000. So we beat pop culture. I think because this has great resonance for people. This is us at the American Alliance of Museums convention, where we got that exhibitor spot on the floor. It was 9 times larger than the American Museum of Natural Histories, and right next to theirs. Again, this is the shit disturbing phase, pardon my French, family friendly event, but we took that opportunity to recreate dioramas and installations from the American Museum of Natural History, but this time include previously excluded socio-political context. So this is a diorama that was in an exhibition about climate change that the American Museum of Natural History had several years prior. Which was a decent exhibition, and this diorama in particular we thought was amazing. It has this embedded commentary within it. It depicts a polar bear atop an ice cap with the detritus of urban waste, consumer waste. We just thought it could be improved here. This is us on the convention floor with the addition of a Koch Industries pipeline, the museum's donor and sponsor. And here another diorama asking the question of, will the story of the sixth mass extinction ever include the role of its sponsors? Right? Scientists say we are in the middle of the sixth mass extinction, in the biodiversity crisis or biocultural diversity crisis is an emergency. And this is the dinosaur wing named after David Koch, depicted 200 years forward into this sort of dystopic future where a human skeleton is contemplating an Allosaurus skull. And this is a piece that features a water fountain of the kind that you'll find in the American Museum of Natural History. And it's a nod to institutional critique artist Hans Hacke's famous seminal work, The Condensation Cube, that had sort of similar themes. So we had these two tanks that circulated water. One was water sourced from North Pole, from the American Museum of Natural History, and then the other from North Pole, Alaska. So the exhibit label on this started out clean, but the water circulating across the tanks, right, talks about how New York City drinking water is actually, believe it or not, some of the best drinking water, cleanest out there. And in 2014, New York banned fracking, which was a big campaign in the state. So we're fortunate in New York City to continue to enjoy clean drinking water. In North Pole, Alaska, the water there was contaminated with chemicals leaked from an oil refinery owned by Koch Industries. So you see that our systems are connected. Right? This was all fun, but I do want to say that for those of you familiar with your art history, this work was coming out of this lineage of other artists like Fred Wilson and Hans Hacke and Andrea Fraser and Mark Dion, whose practice is known as institutional critique, sort of using the vocabularies of the spaces and the aesthetics and forms, presentation forms of the spaces that they're intervening in, kind of reorganizing or hacking them to reveal excluded politics or issues not represented. But for us, it was not about sort of reiterating institutional critique. We were quoting it. That was a stage set at the American Alliance of Museums Convention. It was a backdrop for us to have dozens and dozens of conversations with museum professionals and leaders about their aspirations and points of pain. So it enabled us to, almost like a union organizing project, identify our allies on the inside of the sector and folks that we could continue to work with and to push for transformation. On the occasion of the Paris Climate Summit, the United Nations Climate Summit in 2016, I believe, we raised funds and brought other art and activism and creative and cultural groups from around the world who are doing similar work, calling on their cultural institutions to do more, to do better. And all of us in our respective locations had gotten a lot of media attention and traction with our projects and interventions, but it had never been sort of packaged and articulated as a rapidly growing nascent cultural movement. And so it was this intervention at the Louvre, sponsored by Eni and Total, two European state-owned oil companies, that we launched the fossil-free culture music movement with this intervention. And I am going to talk at the end of the presentation about this red line that you see at the bottom. So we'll just a little Easter egg planting that there for you. We came back stateside and teamed up with 350.org and other organizations to launch a museum divestment campaigns, wanting to move the fossil fuel divestment movement, like in the days of tobacco divestment, into the cultural space, where calling on these museums to implement ethical funding policies, to drop fossil fuel sponsors, and to divest from fossil fuels. So pretty quickly, actually, within 1 hour of launching, there's a couple hours of launching that campaign, the director of the California Academy of Sciences posted a blog post saying that they were not only divesting, but also getting rid of their, holdings in mineral and mineral rights and leases, and making this really bold statement. Again, that behind the scenes slow burn, with all the flashy campaigns that we wage, there's also the work that is going on within institutions and other spaces that is not so visible, but is essential. Our movements need to be from the outside in and the inside out. And in this case, one of our collective co-founders worked at the California Academy of Sciences at the time. And for the whole year previously, once we had launched our project, had been bringing up this issue at staff meetings and in office hours with the directors. So seeding the ground for the first domino to fall. And then others followed suit. So within a couple of years, 9 institutions that we know of stepped up to the plate, from the Field Museum in Chicago, Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Garden, London Science Museum, and the American Museum of Natural History did slash their investments down to 2%. They didn't call it divestment. The movement would call that divestment. Finally, we got Coke off the board. 552,000 petition signatures later, and a lot of media attention, a lot of scientist organizing, and that was successful. And what I love about that was the news headlines. David Koch apparently defeated in battle with scientists. That was the goal there. So this work was, in our minds, just scratching the surface, right? We're not just pressuring museums around fossil fuel sponsors or big polluters whose presence, that don't necessarily result in censorship. We wouldn't claim that. But the self-censorship that can happen when you don't want to offend your board member or biggest donor, or when particular exhibits see the light of day and others don't, based on the funding, right? But that's just scratching the surface. We've already established these spaces are very influential, and we wanted to get into the content, like in this time of climate and biocultural diversity challenges, where just 2 days ago, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration put out a report that said that our carbon emissions are at that the carbon in the atmosphere is at the highest level as it's ever been in 4 million years. And so I think it was 419 parts per million, right? What are the stories? What are the narratives that museums and natural history professionals and fields and disciplines are bringing forth in the world? We were invited to do an exhibition in Houston, Texas. So we teamed up with Tejas, a local environmental Latinx environmental justice organization, along the fence line of the second largest petrochemical complex in the world. And Houston is the only place in the country, only large city in the country that has no zoning regulations. So in East Houston and Manchester, you see homes that are kissing chemical tanks in the shadow of refineries. And this is one of the folks we worked with there on an exhibition called Mining the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences. And this is, again, still in the shit disturbing phase. We put up billboards in the city. And I'm going to play a video about the exhibition that we did at an art space called Project Row Houses with Tejas.
Is the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences a museum or a PR front for the fossil fuel industry? That's the central question of Mining the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences, an investigation by the Natural History Museum. This is our exhibition. We're a mobile and pop-up natural history museum that looks at the fossil fuel ecosystem, including museums of science and natural history that mediate our understandings of fossil fuels, energy, and the environment. Here we are in the belly of the beast, one of the world's largest petrochemical hubs, where the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences is sponsored by a who's who of oil and gas companies, many of them headquartered here in Houston. So in this exhibition, we're taking a look at some of the installations and dioramas inside the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences. So for instance, this diorama is a replica of one found in the museum's Texas Coastal Ecology Wing. It's an almost exact replica. In fact, the photographic backdrop is a photograph of the Houston Museum's diorama, but we included a little bit more, almost as if we sort of stepped back from the frame to get a broader shot, taking a look at what they include and also what isn't found inside the museum. What's missing is any of these socio-political, socio-cultural, economic impacts of fossil fuel exploration and extraction. In the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences, there's a sponsorship wall where the size of the name corresponds to the size of the contribution. The more money they give, the larger their name is on the wall. On ours, the larger their CO2 or carbon emissions, the larger the name. One of the sponsorship perks to donors that contribute $25,000 or more to the museum is that their employees get priority training scheduling to become volunteer docents of the museum's energy hall. So here is an ExxonMobil employee who is a volunteer docent giving tours of the Weiss Energy Hall to school kids and field trips. The song that you hear playing here is one that plays in a cartoon video in the Energy Hall. Many kids come to visit the museum and take these guided tours on field trips. Also, local area kids, if they grew up within 2 miles of the Houston Ship Channel where industry is concentrated, have a 56% greater likelihood of getting childhood leukemia than kids who grow up elsewhere. This is Operation Dinosaur. We're teaming up with Tejas, a local environmental justice group, to put out dozens of these dinosaurs with air quality monitoring badges. These are the same that workers wear inside refineries and chemical plants to monitor what's in the air that they're breathing. We're recreating the conditions of a study conducted in 2005 by the Houston Chronicle, where they put up dozens of these badges in the fence line communities in the east end of Houston. So now, a little more than 10 years later, we're asking those same questions, trying to generate data to understand what's in the air that people are breathing.
These are things that are usually used for workers, and they wear them while they're working on site at the facility for 24 hours or whatever period they're looking at. And that tells the company whether the worker is being exposed to unsafe levels. Well, these were designed to be right there on the site. And what the study of Houston Chronicle's research showed was that these levels are unsafe in neighborhoods, away from the sites, away from the properties and facilities.
Tejas does a lot of toxic tours, and we're teaming up with them to host monthly toxic tours during the exhibition. We've created this map for Tejas's toxic tours, and it tells you where the refineries are, schools, residential areas, petrochemical plants, metal recycling facilities, diesel trucks and highway traffic, ship transport. And wherever you see a dinosaur figurine, that's where we're going to be placing our air quality monitoring badges over the next few months. For our final installation, we have a couple hologram videos in here inside miniature dioramas. Here is a mini diorama of Manchester and Houston's East End with members of Tejas giving one of their toxic tours.
There are times that we even have leaks and explosions that we hear and sirens that go off. And sometimes we have derailments in the communities. And luckily, we haven't had anything explode.
And this one is inside the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences. You'll see the Natural History Museum's museum anthropologist offering a tour of the ways in which the Houston Museum trains its visitors to take the perspective of the energy industry. That's it for our tour today, kids. Hopefully, you've gained some skills in learning how to see, what to see, and what remains excluded from our seeing. Until next time, museum anthropologists.
So I want to transition from that phase of the work. It was a provocation, but I think we learned a lot too. We made our point. But as I said before, it's not just about shaking a fist or in that case, a middle finger, but really thinking about how to build alliances and how to partner with institutions who are invested in creating new models, right? And so this is our next phase, organizing around science for the common good. And it was around the 2016 election, right after the election, where we started to see all kinds of cabinet position nominees who were anti-science, and scientists became very concerned about what the headlines were calling the war on science. And we've been working with scientists from the American Geophysical Union, the largest global association of climate and earth scientists, for about a year. And they had reached out with an interest in working together on getting Exxon out of the American Geophysical Union as sponsors, and thought, with our upcoming convention, that would be a good opportunity to sort of escalate that campaign. But after the election, it was really clear to us that with this as the very first science convention a few weeks later, that it was now a global stage for a much bigger message. And so we had no idea, if they'd be game, because to date we'd just heard we're neutral, we don't advocate, etc. But with this attack on science, not knowing whether scientists would feel emboldened or fearful, this was our next experiment. And so we organized on short notice a demonstration, a rally, and handed out white lab coats and signs and visuals, and curated a program that put scientists shoulder to shoulder with the community leaders in the Bay Area, whose communities were most impacted by the war on science. And this ended up getting 500 climate and earth scientists turned out and got coverage in papers around the world. I love this tweet from that demonstration. This is like nerd achievement unlocked to have George Takei to tweet. A prime example of how to resist in the Trump era. And then Bill McKibben, when scientists protest, their picket signs have footnotes. And it was then that, we started to really play with science communication frames that were decidedly not neutral, but aspirational, right? Because it's not all kinds of science that were on the chopping block, right? It's the science that protects the people and places we love. And so casting the scientists in this more sort of active role of speaking truth to power, protecting our communities, and so on. And then when the AAAS, world's largest science convention, took place in Boston a few months later, we organized a rally again, this time with 3,000 scientists and supporters that the New York Times live streamed. And then became co-organizers and board members of the March for Science, with our visuals at the front. Sort of intentional intervention so that the messaging was not just self-preservation for our jobs as scientists, or yay, facts and evidence, or curiosity, but rather, science that serves the common good, right? And this took place on every continent across the globe, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. And there was an underwater March for Science. And there was even a penguin March for Science at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So then Standing Rock took place. The Dakota Access Pipeline was proposed to go through ancestral territories and right past the Standing Rock Sioux Tribes Reservation, threatening their water supply and sacred sites. And it was when the bulldozers desecrated sites sacred to the tribe that the Standing Rock mobilization really captured the world's attention. And I think it was horrifying to see what felt like history repeating itself, yet at the same time, it felt like there might be an opportunity this time to change the end, right? And so we worked with artists and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and our friend and board member, Judith LeBlanc from Native Organizers Alliance, reached out after the bulldozer incident and said, this is the time for solidarity and support. Can you get your people? And we were like, wow, I don't know. That's, but we'll try. And so we initiated a sign-on letter that within a few days, 1,400 museum directors and officials, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians signed on to, denouncing the destruction of natural and cultural heritage and the pipeline and supporting the tribe. And it was featured in the New York Times and again, outlets around the world. And this is where John Eagle Sr., the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, said on Facebook, we have gained a powerful new base of allies, and renewed attention is now being paid to the National Historic Preservation Act and the ability of tribes to protect significant ancestral lands and waters and historic sites that we all care about and rely upon and love. So taking some of that work and those insights again into this sort of publishing and proselytizing and panel discussions and other spaces within science and natural history and museums. This is the American Alliance Museums publication that goes out to 30,000 professionals. And we published a feature story on the right side of history. How can museums support Native-led climate justice efforts? And this was our first attempt at modeling that in collaboration with the Lummi Nation here in the Pacific Northwest.
Over the past 6 years, the Lummi Nation have been connecting communities on the front lines of the environmental crisis, drawing lines of solidarity in the fight against unsustainable fossil fuel development projects. This fall, they drove the struggle they've been leading into the heart of one of the country's most important museums. Led by a totem pole carved by master carver Jewel James, the Lummi brought with them a formidable delegation of tribal leaders. This was a special and unique opportunity where a major museum was offered as a platform to celebrate the role Native people play as protectors of the earth.
We love to be an ally of the totem pole journey and want to contribute to raising awareness and building alliances.
There are not enough directors who understand the moment and the narrative shift that's needed about Indigenous cultures, about Indigenous peoples, and how we are big players in the struggle to save Mother Earth.
The Lummi and their allies set up an exhibit that was aimed at setting a new standard for other museums to follow. 200 museum directors and decision makers were in attendance for the opening of the exhibit that coincided with an international museum conference.
This is a brand new exhibit. It's called Boy. And you can see the many pictures and the many journeys that we have traveled over the past 5 years to bring education to communities on the effects of fossil fuel.
Visitors learned firsthand about the important role the telling of history plays in shaping culture and public perception.
This here is so culturally relevant.
It means that we're being heard. Our voices are being heard, like they should be for the first time in a long time. And I believe it's very clear what this totem's message is. It's the message of us rising.
For ceremony, a connection was reestablished to the spirit of the land and to the history of the place, stretching back to a time long before the museum was even built.
This resurgence of culture, gathering people in a place like this, where the waters meet. This is a very powerful place where water ruled the area.
That's what nourished this tree before it became this magic piece. And I won't say art because it's a story. It's history. Each of you have laid your hands on it and you've given it your power to continue that story. That's what the totem poles do. That story will continue because you're listening.
The totem pole journey has inspired so many to draw a line against the forces pushing us toward extinction. Now, the Lummi has extended the invitation to museums to join them on the right side of history.
I'm going to be gone a long time from this earth, and this will still be standing saying, we did something. And that's what these museums are about.
In a world of crisis and on the brink of some major global collapse, museums are and need to be agents for change.
How are our future generations going to look at and analyze the decisions that we made that put us in a predicament that we're going to be in the future? This will represent that we did something, that we stood for something, that we wanted to stop it, that we said no to industry, and we said no to money, and we said yes to earth and air and water. That's what we did.
Well, boy, we draw the
So the last phase of work, and I have about 5 more minutes, I think, taking that exhibition and sort of modifying it with the Lummi and other places here in New Jersey with the Princeton Environmental Institute and Watershed Center, and teaming up with Ramapo Lenape Nation, who are fighting the Pilgrim Pipeline, and leveraging that opportunity. And then the Florida Museum of Natural History, working with the Lummi, who had just carved a killer whale pole, an orca pole, and installing an exhibition there that can communicate the relationship to the orcas of the Salish Sea and the threats to the Salish Sea here, our waters on Vashon, right? From tanker traffic and LNG terminals and other concerns. And then modifying that structure that we built for that exhibition there to create an outdoor and IMAX-style film projection venue that could travel the Pacific Northwest and be set up outside in the age of COVID. And I'm not going to show too many photos because this is the exhibit that you'll have an opportunity to see here on Vashon. And the last thing I want to talk about is current ongoing project. We're working with the Lummi and Native Organizers Alliance and Cecilia, regional intertribal nonprofit, on which is called the Red Road to DC. This is the 20-year anniversary of Lummi, the House of Carvers totem pole journeys, and we worked with them to raise funds and organize and develop the vision and strategy and online and offline communications and visuals and all of that for a journey featuring a freshly carved and painted 25-foot, 5,000-pound totem pole that will be that just finished a regional tour, is now going down to the coast of California, is going across to Florida, over to Oklahoma, etc. And then starting in mid-July, the Red Road to DC national tour kicks off from Washington State to Washington, DC, stopping at key places where Indigenous communities are leading efforts to protect water, land, orcas, salmon, and our collective future, from the Snake River dams to Bears Ears to Chaco Canyon, Black Hills, the Line 3 fight at White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, the Line 5 pipeline fight at Bay Mills Indian Community, and ending in Washington, DC, delivering the pole there to the new administration, and an exhibition we developed with Lummi opening at the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian about the totem pole journeys.
The totem pole journey doesn't draw a new line as much as it traces over one that already exists, making it visible. This line runs through the rocks, through the trees, through the sky, through the oceans. The burial grounds of the ancestors weren't only on the land, their bodies were also pushed out to sea. This is why it's not just the land that is sacred, it is also the water. Lessons were taught centuries ago that have been passed down for generations, lessons that guide us as stewards of the earth. The ancestors, in this way, speak through us to ensure the health of future generations. So it's also a line that runs from past to present and into the future. Today we face a great challenge. There's a prophecy that tells of a day when the rivers and skies turn black, the fish and the animals die. But it also speaks of a time when people will stand together to stop this from happening. What's happening in the world today is the result of a perspective that sees everything as a resource to be exploited. It's killing Mother Earth. It threatens life on the planet. People and animals are suffering. They're dying of cancers resulting from the air and the water being poisoned. But they're also fighting back. The Totem Pole Journey is a project that makes visible the struggle for life. It brings awareness to the connectedness of the people to the earth and to history. It ties together communities who are living on the front line of the environmental emergency. It makes the commonality of their suffering visible and strengthens the bonds of solidarity between them. As the totem pole travels from place to place and comes into contact with more and more people, it grows more powerful. People who touch it give it power, and it gives power to them. The journey also spreads the story of the prophecy, and in doing so, it draws a line in the sand. The road that leads to death is not an option. The world is not made up of dead objects, resources to be burned. At this point in history, we are summoning all the forces of life that run through everything to come together in the common collective fight. From the ancestors to our grandchildren, Kwahoi, we draw the line.
There we go. So I'm going to close there in the interest of time, and I think we have a bit of time to kick off discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Beka. That was a very powerful, visual, wonderful presentation. And we do have a question. And she says, I appreciate the visual power of your collaborations. Words also matter. The term climate change was coined by Republican spin doctor Frank Lutz as a less alarming alternative to the more alarming global warming. Greta Thunberg and XR have used other terms such as climate crisis or climate disaster. I wonder what you think about use of this term in your work.
Oh, thank you for that. Yes, that it's important, I think, to unpack terms and also think about what is being used and how to intervene upon predominant understandings. Our collective, our nonprofit organization is called Not an Alternative, right? And so we, our practice has always involved sort of occupying particular discourses, occupying institutions or vocabularies or phrases or terms to intervene and affect their meaning, right? And I do really personally use the climate emergency. I think that has it performs a certain kind of work that climate change doesn't. Global warming. I recall, as an organizer at Greenpeace for many, many years, was greatly debated within movements because of the confusion of it doesn't always show up as warming in your backyard. It might show up as incredible snowstorms or other disasters, weird, wacky weather. So that was the sort of calculus behind using climate change. But I do think that we're in an emergency, and that's what we should call it.
Let's see, there's questions about if this will be available online, and yes, it will be for others to see. And thank you. Everyone is saying thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any. And we are at the top of our hour. So I just want to thank you very much and remind everybody about July 10th, when we will have the totem blessing and the opening of our wild natural wonder and the water people display. And let's see, more thank yous are coming in. So, and that's it. So thank you, Beka, and thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. And we're relative newcomers to Vashon, just moved here 2.5, 3 years ago. And really look forward to meeting everyone that we haven't met, hopefully July 10th at the Heritage Museum.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. All right. If there are no more questions, I think we'll say good night. Good night.